الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakumullahu khairan for attending today. Now, the presentations that we recorded were to support parents in finding out what's going to be taught in schools, engaging in the school so that parents are consulted, and working with other parents to ensure that they can influence what's going to be taught in schools. So I think these are important because they first set out very clearly what the rules and regulations are, what the law is, and then give some advice to parents about what they can do to engage with schools. So without further ado, I'll leave it up to the video to speak for themselves, and then we can discuss them and I'll take any questions as we go through each other.
My name is Yusuf Patel, and I believe parents can make an effective change to how relationship education and relationship and sex education will be taught in schools. As we know, there'll be statutory subjects from September 2020, so we have to ensure that not only do we understand what's going to be the changes, but also what we can do to make an effective change in schools in shaping how these subjects are taught. In order to make a positive change in schools, we need to understand the changes that schools will have to implement from September 2020. We also need to understand what changes we can and cannot make. We cannot, for example, go into our children's schools and say to a school, don't teach relationship education in a primary school. But we can say, don't use that book or program, or don't bring in that outside organization. For this, we have to understand the guidance that sets out what schools need to do, including how schools need to involve parents. We also need to ensure that our approach to schools is positive and effective, as we know that it's not what you say, but how you say it. We need to also ask the right questions to the right people by understanding who are the key decision makers in schools. It is also vital that we understand the factors which make the difference between creating an effective change and not creating a change at all. Finally, it's essential that we as parents are clear on the steps that we should take. These 6 short videos which will follow will have all the information you need to make an effective change in your children's schools. One key issue that we need to understand before we move forward is to ensure that we try and resolve these issues without conflict and in a spirit of partnership. We ask school leaders to reciprocate and involve parents in the planning stages. The next presentation will explain the changes to these subjects from September 2020 and how we can understand what these changes will be. So welcome to the second presentation, but the first real presentation that will cover the changes to sex and relationship education in schools. This will cover in 6 short presentations all you need to know to make an effective change in schools. So we cannot really create an effective change in schools unless we equip ourselves with basic knowledge. The starting point has to be understanding the changes to sex and relationship education in schools. So from September 2020, relationship education will be made a statutory subject in all primary schools. Parents will not be allowed to withdraw from this subject. If a school decides to teach sex education as a separate subject, then parents will still have the right to withdraw from that subject in primary schools. As for secondary schools, relationship and sex education, RSE, will be made statutory from September 2020 in all secondary schools. Parents will not be able to withdraw from the relationship education aspect of RSE, but they will be able to withdraw from the sex education aspect of RSE. They will have to make a request to the head teacher for permission to withdraw their child from the sex education aspect of RSE. And if this request is approved, that request will only last until the child is 15 years old, which is three terms before your child turns 16. The next presentation will cover the scope for change that parents can achieve as set out in the government's guidance.
I think in this presentation we just clarified the changes, and I think sometimes parents can feel very confused by the changes, and that's understandable. But the main idea that we need to focus on is that in primary schools, sex education is not going to be made statutory. In primary school, relationship education is going to be made statutory. So when sometimes lots of primary schools will start saying, we're going to teach RSE, relationship and sex education, from September, that's not correct, because sex education is not statutory in primary schools, but relationship education is. So it's relationship education in primary schools, which you can't withdraw from, but you can influence. And that's what we're going to talk about in the later stages of the presentation. In secondary school, relationship and sex education will be made statutory across the board, but you'll be able to withdraw or request withdrawal from the sex education aspect, but not the relationship education aspect. And this will be clarified as we go through the presentation. But I think it's very important at the outset that we understand the differences between primary and secondary school. I think we can go to the next presentation.
Jazakallah. Administrator, go ahead, please.
In the second of 6 presentations, we'll cover how we can make an effective change in our children's schools. And in this presentation, we'll cover the scope for change in schools. In the previous presentations, we covered the changes to sex and relationship education in schools. And in this presentation, we'll talk a bit more about what changes we can realistically make in schools. And in particular, to focus on the government's guidance that covers how this subject should be taught. Now, we can transform the way in which schools teach RE or RSE. That may sound like a bold claim, but I believe that is the case. In order to do this, we have to understand what the guidance requires of schools, so that we can remind schools of our central role as parents in shaping how these subjects are taught. The government guidance on RE and RSE does not make it compulsory for schools to use particular resources. It does not state in which year groups different discussions or topics have to take place. The government has really provided a lot of flexibility for schools. The guidance makes the following points very clear. Number 1, parents are the prime educators and the first teachers for their children. That schools really don't replace parents, but schools support parents in doing this job. Number 2, schools must consult parents in developing and reviewing their policy, which has to meet the needs of pupils and parents and must reflect the community schools serve. Now, I think it's very important that we recognize that the schools are required to consult parents and to take into account the parents and the community the schools serve. Number 3, schools should also ensure that they consult parents. This is very important, and we need to ask for schools to engage with a meaningful consultation with parents. Number 4, all schools should work closely with parents when planning and delivering these subjects. Number 5, schools must also ensure that their teaching and materials are appropriate, having regard to the age and religious background of the pupils. So I think this is very important. That is a very important point that we need to stress. Schools have to take into account the age and religious background of the pupils when deciding on which resources to use and how this subject is to be taught. And finally, schools will retain freedom to determine an age-appropriate developmental curriculum which meets the needs of pupils and also is developed in consultation with parents and the local community. So schools need to adapt how they teach RE and RSE to reflect the age and faith background of pupils, as well as working closely with parents in planning and delivering these subjects. So parents need to be involved at the earlier stages of the planning of these subjects. That is why when you approach schools, you should be confident that you are not asking for special treatment. You just want the school to implement in their planning and delivery what the guidance sets out in terms of the role of parents in shaping these subjects. In the next presentation, we'll talk a bit more about how we can approach schools.
I think this is probably one of the most important things that we need to understand. Sometimes when I speak to parents, they say that what's the point in us really kicking up a fuss in schools? What's the point of us even doing anything in schools? SRE or RSE, RE have been made statutory. What is the point in engaging with schools? And I think what's really important is for us to understand that there are certain things within the guidance and within the way these subjects have been structured that allows for flexibility by schools. One of those things is that schools have not been given, have not been required to teach certain resources or certain books or certain worksheets. And so the school gets to decide on what they teach in consultation with the parents. And one of the key aspects of that consultation with parents is that when they're deciding on the resources, they have to look at the backgrounds of the pupils at their school, their age and religious background. So if it's a school, if there's a significant proportion or a good proportion of people from religious backgrounds, whether Muslim, Christian, Sikh, Hindu, and those parents make it clear that we want this taught in a particular way based upon our faith perspective, or don't want our faith perspective not to be understood when the school is looking at resources, then the school has to take that into account. That doesn't mean that parents get to choose what the resources are, but if lots of parents are saying, we don't want this to be taught, we don't want these resources to be taught, then schools have to listen to those views. The second aspect of the changes that the flexibility that schools have is that the school has the government has set out a number of learning outcomes that children have to know by the end of primary school and by the end of secondary school. Now, these learning outcomes are set out, but the age groups by which they have to be covered are not mandated, which means that it doesn't say at year 1 this particular topic area has to be discussed, or year 2 this has to be discussed. Rather, what it says is that schools have the flexibility in consultation with parents to decide when to teach these curriculum requirements. I think if you want more details of this, we've created some visuals on the website, and it contains key aspects of the statutory guidance. And really, I think it's important that we understand these key aspects of the statutory guidance, because when we approach schools, we need to remind them that this is what's required. So, for example, it says schools must ensure that their teaching and materials are appropriate, having regard to the age and religious background of their pupils. All schools should work closely with parents when planning and delivering these subjects. So it's very important that we approach this having looked at what the requirements are. So, for example, if you look at the website SREIslamic.org, you will find these visuals there. It covers what the requirements are in primary schools, in secondary schools. What does the statutory guidance say? And so it's very important that we equip ourselves with the knowledge when approaching schools, so that what we're saying is factual, accurate, and it's powerful when we approach schools. I think we can go to the next presentation.
Welcome to the third of 6 presentations, which enable parents to make an effective change in shaping how RE and RSE will be taught in schools. Now, we've already covered the changes to sex and relationship education in schools. We've talked about the guidance and how it maintains the position of parents as being involved and should be involved in shaping how these subjects are taught at school. In this presentation, we'll speak about how we should approach schools. I want us to think about an example of where we've managed to influence someone, whether it's by changing someone's mind or convincing somebody about the merits of a particular decision. Now, what were the key factors in influencing their decision and convincing them that what we put forward is something that they should take into account? Now, I think there's 2 key factors we need to understand, or we need to keep in mind when we approach schools. One is most of the time, it's not really what you say, although that does matter. But what counts more is how you say it. Now, remember, we're trying to aim for positive engagement with our children's schools. And we want to avoid conflict at all costs. That means we need to thank schools, because schools do an excellent job with our children. They educate our children and they support our children to be better people. And so I think it's something that we need to keep that in mind and thank schools for that role that they play, that pivotal role they play in our children's lives. The second thing is, apart from thinking about how we say things and positively engaging with schools, the second point is really about our relationship with schools. And I think it's very important that we invest in building strong and positive relationships with our children's schools. And that's whether that's by becoming a governor in a school or just volunteering at our children's schools. The better the relationship that we have with our children's schools, the more positive your relationship will be, the more your views will be listened to by the school. Your initial approach needs to be to the head teacher. And that initial approach needs to be a positive one. You are a parent of a child at school, and you are concerned about some of the changes that will happen to relationship education and relationship and sex education in schools. And you've heard a lot in the news, you've heard a lot from other people, and you want to understand a bit more about what the school's plans are for teaching this subject from September 2020. So you should also talk about how the school, you believe that you understand the school is required to consult parents and get parents engaged at the earliest possible stages. And you also recognize that what's happening in other schools around the country should not happen in our school. We don't want conflict in schools. We want parents and schools to work closely together in the interests of our children. So what you should do is offer your services. Say, look, I want to be a part of the consultation process. I want to be a part. If you've got a curriculum committee as part of the governing board, a curriculum committee, I want to be a part of that. I want to be consulted as part of that process. At this stage, you don't really need to go into any further detail unless the head teacher asks. But really, just offer your services to the school to be a part of the process in shaping how these subjects will be taught from September 2020. Thank you. And the next presentation will really cover the types of questions you need to ask to the head teacher.
At this stage, what's very important to note is that obviously these presentations were recorded last year, and there's been a couple of changes since then, not major changes, but changes with regards to obviously the coronavirus pandemic. The one thing it's very important to state at this stage, I think, is that although schools are required to teach relationship education in primary schools and relationship education in secondary schools from September 2020, the law as it stands will be implemented or is enacted from September 2020. That's when the law takes place. But the Department of Education has said, because of the coronavirus pandemic, because of the fact that lots of schools had to close suddenly in March, and many schools, probably most schools, didn't have the opportunity to prepare for the new subject from September 2020. So that the Department of Education has said that implementation can be suspended until at the summer term, the beginning of the summer term of 2021, which is around April of 2021. So I think one of the important things to note here is that there is still a huge opportunity for us to engage with schools. So we say that it's going to be implemented from September 2020. First of all, when we go back to schools, and I'll talk about this a little later, but I think it's important just to state now, is that we need to ask to engage. We need to ask what will the school do to ensure that parents like me, our views are taken into account in relation to shaping how and when this subject is going to be taught in my children's school. So it's very important that we start that engagement process as soon as we get back to schools. And we say to schools as well that, have you heard that the government or the Department of Education has allowed schools to delay implementation until April 2021, and encourage the school obviously to take up that opportunity, because if the school hasn't consulted you, if you've not been approached to ask for your views about these new subjects, then the school is not prepared. So we need to ask for them to delay, but then that gives them an opportunity for them to engage with us and for us to shape how these subjects are going to be taught. So I think we can go into the next video, inshallah.
So welcome to presentation 4 in our 6-part presentation that will cover how we as parents can make an effective change in schools in the area of RE and RSE. So far we've covered the changes to sex relationship education in school, what the guidance says about the involvement of parents in schools, as well as how we approach schools. And in this presentation we'll really cover the types of questions you need to ask the head teacher or the key influences in your child's school. So firstly, we need to understand who are the key decision makers in your children's school. The key decision makers are the head teacher and the chair of governors, who is the lead member or the lead the person in charge of the governing board. So it's very important that we approach those people in the first instance. If you approach your child's teacher may be able to give you some information, but they're not going to be able to make a decision or get you involved in the process of how to shape these subjects in the school. That's the domain of the head teacher and the chair of governors. So you can either have this interaction and ask these questions in a conversation or through email or a letter. Now it's very important that some of the interactions with the head teacher are in writing so that we can have a paper trail for future reference. Some of the questions that you need to ask your head teacher and chair of governors are: which organizations are going to be involved in shaping or in advising the school and in terms of how these subjects are going to be taught from September 2020. Now, the organization a school is advised by will shape what is taught, which resources are used, and also how far from your values the final program will be. Now, we would advise that parents ensure that there are no outside agencies involved and advising school about these subjects. Now, number 2, what resources will be used? Now, even if there's no outside agency that's involved in advising the school may use resources that are inappropriate. It's important that you have a conversation with your child's school, with the head teacher or the chair of governors, to make them understand what you consider to be inappropriate. So there may be explicit images used in certain lessons that you think these are not appropriate for our children to be shown. It could be that some topics are delivered too early, and you think that something's delivered in year 1 which should be delivered maybe in year 5 or year 6. And also, maybe there's too much information in a particular year group. You say, actually, there's too much, maybe we could spread that out to the later year groups. And also, it may be promoting sexual decision making as though they are facts or moral when they are not. So sometimes schools will teach different relationships in a way which seems as though this is a fact, but actually it's an opinion. And so we need to make sure that schools make a clear distinction between what are facts and what are values, and values are opinions. Now, the third question is how will the school meaningfully consult parents? We need to ask the school to engage in a consultation with parents, but that consultation process cannot be a tick box exercise. It has to involve parents at a real level, at a meaningful level, so that parents can input into the process and those decisions can be taken into account and when the final decisions are being made by the school. So you need to make clear to the school that they need to have a very transparent and very open consultation process, so that the consultation process is clearly laid down and not ad hoc. So we know from the beginning of the process to the end what the stages will be. The consultation must clearly set out the pivotal role that parents play in feeding into the planning and delivery of these subjects as set out in the guidance by the government. In the next presentation, we'll cover some issues that we need to think about as parents when we're trying to create that change in our children's school. Thank you.
I think the major point here is that parents have got to ensure that schools meaningfully consult them. Now, what does meaningful consultation actually mean? Because one of the problems is that when the government sets out for primary and secondary schools to consult with parents, it has not, they don't clarify, they haven't clarified with sufficient detail what that consultation actually looks like. So what we've got to do is when we approach schools, we've got to ask them how are they going to involve the views of parents in shaping decision making around RE and RSE. So let me give you an example between meaningful and just a tick box exercise. Imagine if a school is going to use a particular set of resources. They show those resources to parents, and parents say, no, we're not happy with these aspects of the resources. These aspects are just not appropriate. They're not clearly linked clearly with the curriculum outcomes, and they go through subjects that are not required to be taught to our children at this early stage. We don't think it's appropriate. These aren't appropriate resources. Now, if a school can say either they can say, okay, that's a good point. Okay, we're going to review those, and some of the things that you said that are not appropriate we'll take out of the resources. That's meaningful. Or it could say, no, we're going to teach these anyway. We bought them, and we're going to teach these to your children. That's a tick box exercise, because if their decisions at the beginning of the consultation process are the same than at the end of the consultation process, that means that there's been no meaningful consultation with parents. It's very important that we need to ask schools to clarify what consultation actually looks like. Now, the government did set out in a supplementary guidance around consultation and what it should look like. Now, on the website we've taken some of those quotes around parental engagement. Yeah. So, for example, it says consultation is a process by which an organization over a specific period of time seeks the opinions of relevant people about particular activities or proposals to better understand their views and take them into account when making final decisions. For schools, consultation is about them providing formal channels through which parents can express their views about certain aspects of the work. And it says engagement means schools providing the opportunity for parents to feed in their views on the school's proposed relationship education policy, which includes considering whether any strongly held views of their parent body should lead the school to adapt when and how they approach certain topics with their pupils. So it's very important that we require schools to engage with parents at a meaningful level about consultation. Now, one thing that's very important is about resources. When we ask questions about what resources are you planning to use, we shouldn't just say, what are you planning to use, but we should also ask them for our views. We should ensure when there's a consultation process that we see all resources. Because sometimes some schools will show you part of the resources, but if they give you maybe 10% of the resources, that doesn't enable you to make an informed judgment about whether you think they're appropriate or not. You need to see much more. You need to see 100% of the resources to be able to make that informed judgment. But also what's really important is that in the past, I've said that it's very important that we ensure that the worst of resources are left out of schools. But the thing is, there are no really good resources and there are no really bad resources. But there are aspects of all resources which are inappropriate. So if you say to a school that has bought a resource, we don't want this resource completely, then a school will probably not really listen to you, even though they should. But what we should say is that there are aspects of these resources which are good, which is fine. Yeah, it talks about importance of family. It talks about staying safe online. That's really good. But these aspects of the resources are not appropriate. We don't want these aspects. So if you give a constructive feedback to schools around the resources, your views will be more likely to be taken into account. And so I think that's what the main thing we need to do is just really ask questions to schools around the resources, around the process, how parents are going to be involved, and really just say to schools, look, I want to be involved in that process. I think we can go on to the next presentation.
Welcome to presentation 5 of our 6-part presentation, which will equip and enable and empower parents to make an effective change in our children's schools. Now, in this final presentation, we're going to talk a bit about some things that we need to consider as parents when we're engaging with our children's school. But so far, just to recap on what we've talked about so far, we've talked about the changes that will take place to sexual relationship education in schools from September 2020. We talked about what the guidance says and the pivotal role that the guidance places parents in terms of shaping these subjects. We talked about how we should approach our children's school and how that should be a positive engagement. And in the last presentation, we talked about the types of questions you should ask the head teacher and the chair of governance. In order to create long-term change in schools, we have to be aware of the key factors that enable us to create that effective change. Now, we said before that we believe that when we approach schools and ask to be involved in shaping how these subjects are going to be taught, we believe most schools will respond in a very positive way and get parents involved in that process. There will be a hard core of schools which unfortunately will not respond to parents. And we need to think about how we approach those schools and how we convince them that actually it's in their best interests to engage parents and involve them and follow what the government guidance suggests. But there are certain key points that we need to bear in mind when we're approaching those types of schools. One is persistence. If you want to achieve a lasting change in schools, as with anything else in life, you have to be persistent, as you might face opposition from schools, and therefore you need to keep going until you reach your objective. Number 2 is about a long-term focus. We need to recognize that things cannot change overnight, and we cannot change things in schools overnight, especially if the school is very resistant to the input from parents or the change that parents are asking of schools. It may take weeks or months, and that requires for parents to be persistent but also have that long-term focus. The school is not going anywhere, and so we need to ask ourselves, are we going to stick to our principles? Are we going to continue to remind schools of their responsibility to apply the government guidance in involving parents? So I think we need to recognize that either we get what we want fully or close enough for us to be assured that actually this is enough for us in terms of shaping what the subject is going to be in terms of from September 2020. Number 3 is about unity, about parents working together with a common aim, with that common objective. And it's very important that parents do stick together and don't allow the school to play parents off against one another. Number 4 is about a wide buy-in. We need to have as many parents involved in these campaigns as possible. Parents of different faiths, parents of even no faith. As long as the parents agree upon the concerns that these subjects can be taught in a very inappropriate way and that we want to work together to ensure what is being taught is appropriate to our children's needs, then as parents you can work together with people from different backgrounds. Number 5 is really about a clear goal. What are you trying to achieve? That's an important question that you need to ask yourselves at the earliest possible stage. Is everyone clear on what you're trying to achieve? And is everybody clear throughout the campaign on what you're trying to achieve? Often writing down the goals and getting others to sign them can help everyone to stay on message. That's just a suggestion as to how to ensure that parents remain united upon that common objective. So it's very important that as parents we are clear on what we're trying to achieve. You should aim high, but depending upon the circumstances, you may not be able to achieve all the things you want. But you need to know this, that by interacting with schools, you'll be able to achieve much more than if you don't engage with the school. We also need to make clear that we shouldn't have a narrow focus in terms of our concerns. We believe that any relationship outside of marriage between a man and a woman is invalid. Whether that be premarital or extramarital sexual relationships between a man or a woman, between sexual relations between a man and a man, or a woman and a woman. We must make it clear that we do believe that children need to be taught to respect everybody, whoever they are, but must not be prematurely sexualized by introducing them to a concept of sexual relationships or to relationships that they are not they're not ready for because of their age. Now, the government has set out certain clarifications that are very important for us to understand. The government says that pupils should receive teaching about LGBT relationships during their school years, and they say that they expect secondary schools to teach this. But primary schools are encouraged to cover LGBT content if they consider it age appropriate to do so. But there is no specific requirement for them to do so. So this is very clear that primary schools especially, are not required to teach about LGBT relationships if they don't believe it's age appropriate to do so in the primary years. Secondly, I think the government has also clarified very recently another point, that schools will be required to consult with parents. Initially, in the guidance, that was watered down. There was not a commitment for schools to engage with parents. But in the clarification, the government clarified that schools will be required to consult with parents when developing and reviewing their policies for relationship education and RSE, which will inform school decisions on when and how certain content is covered. So effective consultation gives a space and time for parents to input, ask questions, share concerns, and for the school to decide the way forward. So schools will listen to parents' views and then make a reasonable decision as to how they wish to proceed. So we are not asking for special treatment. We're just asking for the schools to implement what the government has set out for schools to implement. In the final presentation of our 6-part presentation, we'll cover step by step how we can make an effective change in our children's schools. Thank you.
I think the main point here is that I think we need to recognise what is our role as parents when we engage with schools. Now, in terms of we set our goals very high, but that we do not we expect schools sometimes to resist everything we ask for. So we ask for 20 things, they may give us 5 things. If we ask for 10 things, they may give us 2 things. We need to set our goals high, but recognize that we may not be able to achieve every single thing that we want to achieve. But I think rest assured that if you engage with schools, you're going to achieve much more than if you don't. Yeah. And so it's really important that parents work together to engage with schools and ensure that what's being taught is appropriate to our children's age, religious background, and is appropriate for their needs. I think one thing that's important is that one of the concerns that parents have is about the teaching LGBT relationships. And I think in this instance, what we need to do is say that there is a huge lobby out there who are really saying to schools, you need to teach these things at an earlier and earlier age. Yeah, this has been happening. It's not the last year or the last 2 years. This has been happening over the last 20 years. Yeah, it's been a long battle, and they've put a lot of money into it, and they've lobbied government, and they've tried to create. They've used the situation of society moving further and further away from religious values and moving more and more to secular liberal values. They've used that to try and get schools to teach more and more around these subjects. Now, what we need to do is recognize that our interaction with schools is going to, inshallah ta'ala, with the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is going to minimize the harm. It may not completely take away all of the harm, but it will minimize the harm. Now, what does that mean? It means that a school, for example, what we need to ensure that schools do not do is they don't teach LGBT relationships in a way which is opinion wrapped up in facts or proportion to be facts. So, for example, they may say to Abdullah, you might be gay. Yeah, that is completely unacceptable. Schools should not be engaging in that type of conversation because that's not the role of schools. A school might say to Maryam, you are a girl, but you might be a boy, and it's possible that you may change your mind about your gender in the future. And there's a way you can change your gender. This is completely unacceptable. It's not what we expect schools to be teaching our children. But what we will say to schools is, look, if you are saying the main reason to teach these subjects is to create some sort of equality or to ensure that children are growing up and treating other children and other people, treating them with respect, then that's fine. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. We teach our children to be respectful of everybody. Maybe an atheist who we don't agree with, but we still ask our children to treat them politely. There may be somebody who commits zina. We still teach our children to treat them with respect. Every human being should be treated with respect. But that doesn't mean that you teach this subject in a way which is imposing your value perspectives on our children. So you say, look, if schools do, first of all, want to say we have to teach LGBT relationships, Ofsted is going to inspect us and we need to teach it. So, okay, if you can't convince them of that, say, let's teach it in the later years. So why teach it in year 2 or year 3? That's too young. Why don't we teach it in year 5 or year 6? And when you do teach it, you need to make sure you teach it in a way which says, okay, there's people who have different relationships, they exist in the society, yeah, and we've got to treat them with respect. That's fine. But don't go beyond that. Don't go beyond the factual reality, and don't start going into it's okay to be gay, it's okay to be a boy who wants to be a girl or girl who wants to be a boy. That's going beyond what is required. So our role is really to minimize the harm and engage in schools to do that. And that's a really important role. And I think much later on, we can talk about the fact that it's not just about what's happening in schools, but the Mufti Danker said Mufti Yusuf said at the beginning that it's very important that we take full responsibility for the tarbiyah, the upbringing, the nurturing of our children according to our values and our deen. And that's a fard ain, that's a responsibility from every single one of us. And that we can talk about that later. So we're not just saying that this is just one approach, but this is one of many approaches that we need to take to ensure that our children are raised and kept upon this deen and become strong Muslims. I think we can play the final presentation and then we can take some questions, inshallah.
Welcome to our final part of a 6-part series that enables and empowers parents to make an effective change to RE and RSE in schools. So far we've covered the changes to sex and relationship education in schools. We've talked about what the guidance says about the role of parents in shaping how these subjects should be taught and how schools should involve parents. We talked about how we should approach schools and the types of questions you should ask a head teacher. And in this last presentation, we spoke about how to create effective change in schools and the key factors which enable that effective change to take place. Now, in this final presentation, we want to look in some detail at the steps you should take today to create an effective change in your child's school. So number one, we talked about understanding. We talk about that knowledge is power, that in order to make an effective change in school, we need to understand what the guidance sets out for schools to engage with parents, what schools are required to teach from September 2020. We talked about we talked about how parents need to be informed about how schools need to involve you as parents in the planning and delivery of these subjects as set out in the guidance, as well as taking into account the age and religious background of pupils. Secondly, we need to find out about how the school is currently teaching sexual relationship education. This give us an insight into what the current situation is, and help us to start those discussions about what the plans are for the future. Number three, we need to plan our first positive interaction with the head teacher. We need to offer our services to the head teacher to say, look, I want to be a part of that consultation process. I want to help shape the planning and delivery of these subjects as set out in the guidance. Remember to be polite, to ask questions, and to be as constructive as possible, and not critical or argumentative. Number four, we need to ask questions about the planning for RSE and RE. We need to ask questions about which outside agencies are being used to advise the school, and we said that we need to make sure that there are no outside agencies involved in that process. The timetable for planning for these subjects, and how parents are going to be meaningfully consulted. And I think we also need to ask the school what that process is and what the timetable for that process is, so that we can get involved in that process from the earliest stages. You can also address these questions in a letter to the governing board, or write a separate letter to them or to the head teacher as well. The 2019 edition of the Governance Handbook, which sets out the rules and the things that governing boards need to look out for and understand with regards to their role. It sets out the requirement for governing bodies to meaningfully consult parents. So governing bodies, especially governing bodies in local authority maintained schools, which is all schools except academies and free schools, which are the vast majority of schools are maintained schools. They have a statutory duty to show how the views of parents have influenced the decision making. So not only is that required in RE and RSE, but in all areas of school life. Finally, I think what we need to do is also work with other parents so that the parental voice is heard, and work with a broad selection of parents and ensure that that work takes place in a consistent way with a clear objective and with that widest buy-in as possible. In the coming weeks, we'll be setting up parental groups in different parts of the country. After you take these first steps in approaching the school, and depending upon the answer you receive, we'll then support you however you need in taking those actions on from that first interaction. So we'll be setting up parental groups based in different areas of the country to support parents, so that we can respond in a positive way to those schools who are responding in a positive way. But with those schools who may not have responded in a positive way to parents' requests, then we'll also look at a different approach for those schools. So in order to join those parental groups, please send an email with your name, local area and phone number to Yusuf at SREIslamic.org, and you'll see those details on the bottom of the screen.
Okay, I think so. It's really important that when schools start up again very soon, within the next week or so, that we start to approach the school, and if we haven't done so already, ask them questions. And I think there's a checklist here in terms of what you need to ask. Firstly, we need to ask, have they consulted you about which resources they would use, and when, which year groups they would cover the curriculum outcomes of their RE or RS delivery. So RE, relationship education, is in primary school, and relationship education is in secondary schools. So firstly, ask them, have you consulted so far? And most schools will say, no, we haven't consulted. If you haven't heard from the school, you can say, look, I haven't heard anything about consultation. When are you planning to do it? How are you planning to do it? I'd like to be involved. You need to ask them, what steps have they taken to ensure their resources are going to be appropriate? Have they taken into account the age and religious background of the pupils at the school? Will they delay the implementation of RE or RSE until the beginning of the summer term, April 2021? And to remind them that the Department of Education has made a supplementary guidance, or has provided extra information to schools to say that if they haven't been able to prepare, which most schools haven't because of the coronavirus pandemic, then they can delay the implementation of these subjects until summer term, which is April 2021. So it's very, very important that we ask the schools these questions. And I think it's best now to probably open up to any questions, anything that you've come across, any clarifications that you need. I think the brother will mention how you can submit your questions. Jazakumullah khair for this.